Indonesia formally joins the BRICS group of leading emerging economies. We'll discuss what the addition brings to the global south. Hello, I'm Einar, and this is The Heat. With the start of the new year, Indonesia became the first Southeast Asian country to join BRICS as a full member. In 2006, Brazil, Russia, India and China created the group, with South Africa joining in 2010. Last year, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Iran and Ethiopia formally joined. With the addition of Indonesia for 2025, there are now 10 full members and 8 new partner countries. China's foreign ministry congratulated Indonesia on joining the bloc and described it as a major developing country and an important force in the global south.
China stands ready to work with Indonesia and other BRICS members to jointly build a more comprehensive, close, practical and inclusive partnership, advance the high-quality development of greater BRICS cooperation and make greater contribution to building a community with a shared future for mankind.
For more now on the BRICS expansion, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a senior fellow with the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asian Narratives. Also with us from Boston, Jorge Heine is a former Chilean ambassador to China and research professor with the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University, and Gita Wirjawan is a former Indonesian Minister of Trade and visiting scholar at Stanford University. He joins us from Jakarta. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Gita Wirjawan, let me start with you. As I said, Indonesia has just become the 10th full member of BRICS. It's a pretty significant development for the country. In fact, commenting on its membership, the Indonesian foreign minister said, Indonesia views its membership as a, quote, strategic step to improve the collaboration with other countries, as well as a commitment to strengthening multilateralism cooperation. So looking at this, what kind of impact will membership in BRICS have for Indonesia?
Thank you for inviting me. I think it's quite obvious it's already going to be bringing quite a number of strategic benefits to countries like Indonesia, given the fact that it is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. It is the largest population in Southeast Asia. I think it is a continuation of the desire of large developing economies such as Indonesia to try to be a bit more revisionist to the pre-existing order. Now, in terms of economic benefit creation by way of Indonesia's joining the BRICS, it's been evident that from a trade standpoint, China has already become disproportionately the largest trading partner, not only for Indonesia, but for Southeast Asian countries. What's to come, we hope, is the economic capital flows in terms of foreign direct investment. This is, I think, a necessity, not just for Indonesia and Southeast Asia, but for the remaining countries of Southeast Asia, which I think are vested in not only capturing economic capital formation from large member countries of the BRICS, but also allowing ourselves to move up the value chain. China, I think, has obviously become a very preeminent technological capital allocator, particularly in the context of energy transition. This is, I think, where Indonesia is going to look into.
Right, you mentioned China several times there, Gita, and I was wondering to what extent did China play a role, this relationship that you have with China, play a role in Indonesia's membership in BRICS? In fact, President Subianto went to China, he went to Beijing last November for a state visit, and the two countries at that time signed deals worth $10 billion. They also pledged to strengthen cooperation and their relationship in key sectors, including things like electric vehicles and green energy. So to what extent did China play a role in this move by Indonesia?
I think quite importantly, if, let's say, you were to charge your EV in China, it's probably going to cost you about 5 cents on a per kilowatt hour basis. Whereas if you charge your EV in California, they're going to charge you between 47 to 58 cents on a per kilowatt hour basis. This, I think, explains the very essence that, you know, China, as much as it is already a developed economy, it knows how to think like a developing economy. This is what I think resonates to not only Indonesia, but many developing countries in the world. The $10 billion deals that were signed just a couple of months ago, I think were predominantly in just two spaces. Number one, the digital space, and the other one in the energy transition. These are the natural spaces that would allow, you know, an intersection between Southeast Asia and countries like China in terms of China's ability to allocate technological capital for both, you know, AI and also energy transition purposes. So in essence, I think China played a very prominent role in helping, you know, the group decide with respect to our participation.
Einar Tangen, the last BRICS summit took place in Russia, in Kazan in Russia. President Xi Jinping was there at the time. And during his visit to the summit, he called for greater cooperation among member states. You know, we're seeing a world now that is rapidly changing in so many ways. What does this mean with this BRICS expansion into Southeast Asia?
Well, it has to be made clear that BRICS is about economics. It's not about defensive. It's not the Quad or any of that type of thing. It's really about the developing world. And this has become kind of a synonym with this idea that it's a growing global south oriented group. The question is, how does it go from here? There are great hopes. Obviously, technology, energy are part of what is driving a lot of this, and trade. But it's not a permanent secretariat yet. You have 10 members, 8 on the sidelines, as you pointed out. But the question is, how does it all come together in the future? Obviously, Russia's very interested in settlements systems and also alternative to the U.S. dollar. China is very interested in more trade and sharing technology, infrastructure, everything that's done with the Belt and Road Initiative. And obviously, ASEAN is a very important part of that. So how do you put all these pieces together? There are great hopes, but it is nothing to do with military. It is purely economic.
Right. And as you point out, you know, this is a trade relationship, a trade alliance rather. It is to do with economic relations. It's not some kind of strategic alliance like Quad, as you pointed out as well. But does it act as a counter to other groups, Western groups like the G7?
Well, only if you want to see it that way. I mean, quite frankly, the UN could have been the source of this, but there's been a lot of frustration out there because, for instance, regardless of what country you're talking about, India, China, etc., there was this reluctance by the U.S. and its European allies to recognize them and give them full sway, IMF, World Bank, etc. So, you know, these countries got together and said, look, our interests are in trading, and we want to get away from the politics. So the only way to do that is to start doing something amongst ourselves. And you saw this group of leading nations, you know, they all have issues, but they said, look, we have to try to figure out how we can work together rather than work under a system which is not particularly interested in what we're trying to do.
Anton, you know, as I pointed out, Russia held the BRICS presidency last year, and during that summit, Russia did express its support for BRICS expansion, and more recently, during his visit to Hanoi this week, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin expressed his support for Vietnam's application to join the BRICS group. The countries also agreed to expand cooperation on nuclear power. You know, coming at a time when the West is doing its utmost to try and isolate Russia. This has been ever since we saw that, you know, Russia crossed the border into Ukraine during that conflict. What does something like this expansion into Southeast Asia mean for Russia?
Anand, it means, first of all, that Russia is not isolated, which is a favored talking point here in Washington, D.C. and in other Western capitals. But then again, Russia has not been isolated from the entire global South during this conflict. So that's number one. BRICS for Russia is one of the multiple ways of outmaneuvering the crushing Western sanctions that have been imposed on it. And part of the reason why its economy has so far weathered these sanctions with, frankly, stunning success, given their severity, is proof that the Russians are smart enough to adapt and that they will use alternative trading systems to bypass the Western-dominated system. The irony of the situation around BRICS, and even more broadly, is that the more the West weaponizes the financial and economic instruments that it so intelligently and so successfully actually set up over the past 2 centuries, but especially over the past 60 years, the Bretton Woods system, the more it weaponizes them, the more it encourages countries such as Indonesia, China, Russia, all the BRICS and beyond, not only the 8 extra Western partners, the more it incentivizes these countries to look for alternatives, to hedge their bets. Einar is absolutely right that the BRICS is not really a military or even a geopolitical bloc. It doesn't expand towards other people's borders. It certainly doesn't establish military bases everywhere. It is simply a parallel structure to protect countries' economies should they fall on the wrong side of the United States and its allies. And I think that some of the short-term expectations in the West and the concomitant sort of glee over the failure, let's say, to create an alternative payment system so far, all of this is misplaced because it's the long-term prospects around the BRICS that really matters. It's a system that thrives on complementarity and the equal voice of all of its members. And so far, they have maintained this equilibrium with spectacular success. And one more thing I'd like to mention about what Einar said. The BRICS does not have a headquarters. It does not have a permanent bureaucracy. And in that sense, it's a remarkably decentralized and pluralistic organization. But when you look at its website and when you look at all the committees of all the different ministries from all of these member states that meet on a regular basis to discuss current issues, it's really a stunning list. I mean, it runs all the way from economics and finances all the way to sports, culture, customs unions, anti-terrorism cooperation, justice ministries cooperating, transportation, so on and so forth. So clearly, this is a very delicate geo-economic tapestry that the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Indonesians, now the Brazilians, all of its members are weaving. And it is a direct challenge to only one thing, and that is American hegemony.
Right. Ambassador Heine, Brazil has now assumed the presidency of BRICS. That's for 2025. And the government in Brasilia is pushing an ambitious program. It's entitled Strengthening Global South Cooperation for More Inclusive and Sustainable Government. It says the focus will be on trade and investment, regulating artificial intelligence, climate change, and public health. What are your expectations as Brazil assumes the presidency?
Well, my expectations are pretty high. Brazil did a very good job in chairing the G20 last year. It had a very successful meeting in Rio, which President Xi attended in November. And all eyes are now put on Brazil, which is playing such a significant geopolitical role. Brazil will not only chair the BRICS in 2025, it will also chair COP30 on the vital issue of climate change. So President Lula and his ministers have their work cut out for them. I have high expectations. President Lula is one of the remarkable leaders in the Global South. He has proven to be a very important and very successful coalition builder. He did this in his first 2 terms in office, and he is, again, attempting to do this as well. Now, let me also emphasize the following. I would like to introduce a slight variation to what my good friend Einar said in terms of the economic significance of the BRICS group. I would argue that is very important, but it is not just that. I would argue that BRICS, and this has been reinforced now with the joining of Indonesia, the fourth most populated country in the world, the biggest Muslim majority country in the world, a real power in Southeast Asia and regionally. And the fact that this makes the BRICS into a very important platform for the global South. So this isn't just for economics, it is also for changing an international order that until now has been dominated by the West and is really not delivering. The many crises that we're seeing around the world are proof positive that the world is in real trouble and that changes need to be made in entities like the United Nations, entities like the Bretton Woods institutions, really focus on the global issues, things like financial indebtedness, climate change, mass migrations, that are not really being addressed. In that sense, it seems to me, Indonesia joining the BRICS group marks a very important step in that direction.
Einar, what is your view on that, on Ambassador Heine's view that it does give these countries, these member states, more than just clout among economic relations or trade relations? I mean, we're looking at something else. We were talking about the 8 countries that have been given member status or partner membership, as it's called, and that started on the 1st of January. I mean, these countries include Malaysia, Thailand, Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Cuba, and Uganda. So BRICS now accounts for 48% of the world's population, representing 37% of the world economy. Is all of this going to give it a much greater voice in the world, not just as far as trade relations are concerned, not just as far as economic growth is concerned, but in the way the world is run?
Well, I agree with Jorge. It's a very important grouping, and any grouping is going to attract attention. What is it getting together for? But I would stress once again, this was an own goal by especially the United States. They have, in essence, emasculated the global trade system by refusing to allow appellate judges to be appointed. As a result, you don't get finality there. So countries are banding together to try to figure out ways in which they can, in fact, trade. And by so doing, of course, if you start getting past 50% of the world's GDP and you're at 60, 70% of the world's population, of course it becomes an entity that people have to start thinking about in terms of geopolitical. But that is not the intention. This is not something where it said, okay, well, this is the group that's going up against the United States. Yes, there is a reaction to the U.S. Policies, but the U.S. could change in the future. We tend to look at things right now through the lens of what's in front of us, and people are looking at Donald Trump and wondering what's going to happen next. Obviously, he's not very pro help the rest of the world when it's just make America great again. But I would say that there's a danger in trying to say that somehow BRICS is ganging up on the U.S. or trying to do it. That is not the intention. There's no defensive or offensive military capability or desires.
Right, and I think many countries have made that known, that they're not in the business of having to choose sides in the world right now. Gita, Wirjawan, they are the fellow ASEAN members, Malaysia and Thailand. They've also applied for BRICS membership, and I'm wondering how this changes the picture in Southeast Asia on the one hand, and also does Indonesia, in fact, now that it's become a full member, actually act as a role model for other countries like Malaysia, like Thailand in Southeast Asia?
I'm not sure if it serves as a role model, but certainly it has a meaningful impact on at least Thailand and Malaysia, which have actually submitted, application to BRICS earlier than Indonesia did. And this is, I think, in line with what some of my fellow panelists have indicated. The interest of Southeast Asia, with the absolute exception of Singapore, is really to better put food on the table for its people, and to try to move up the value chain. And this is completely economic, in terms of our participation and a conglomeration such as BRICS. I think it's important to highlight that Prabowo Subianto, our president, has put a premium on a number of things, two of which are really food security and energy security. All those basically dovetail into our desire to move up the value chain and to try to put food on the table for the 280 million people. And I think stuff like that resonates to countries like Malaysia and Thailand. And this is one of the many participations that Indonesia has engaged in. Let's not forget Indonesia signed on with the IPEF. Indonesia signed on with the RCEP. And also is in the process of joining the OECD, or at least it's being considered. So it is in line with the previously noted principle of free and active, which would date back to when things sort of like got started in 1955 at the Asia Africa conference in Bandung, and later on depicted in 1961 in terms of many of the global South members showing an interest in being non-aligned. So I think it is not something that's completely new in terms of Indonesia's showing interest in stuff like BRICS. It is just a continuation of our expression to move up the global order and to move up the value chain.
Ambassador Heine, getting back to what's taking place in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba is another country that wants to become a member of BRICS. Cuba, of course, has been the target of United States sanctions for decades. It's been the target of an economic embargo by the United States. In fact, President Biden is now planning to remove Cuba from what Washington calls a terrorism list. And he's doing this just days, less than a week before he leaves office. It would remove some of the sanctions that were put in place by President Trump when he was the president in 2016. What do you make of what's happening in Cuba right now?
You're asking me?
Yes,
yes.
Ambassador. Yeah.
Well, I must say I was greatly relieved to hear that President Biden made that decision to put Cuba in the category of terrorist sponsoring states, which was one of the last acts of the first Trump administration, was something extremely unwarranted because it has no factual basis. It was simply a political decision, playing politics basically to the Cuban American community in Florida. Many people thought that President Biden would remove this when he got into office, but he didn't. Better late than never, you might say. This has brought much economic damage to Cuba. Let us hope it is not reinstated by the second Trump administration. And it seems to me it really devalues the very notion of states sponsoring terrorism, which just apply it willy-nilly to states that actually do not engage in such activities. So let us keep our fingers crossed that this will not be reinstated in coming months or years.
Anton, Indonesia's Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources has expressed an openness to importing oil from Russia. China, India, as well as Turkey already import oil from Russia. We talked about that a moment ago, the fact that there are Western sanctions on Russia. Does this effectively render Western sanctions useless?
Yes, it does. They will create some problems, especially the latest round on Russian oil companies and shipping companies. But as the Russians have shown over the past 2.5 years, almost 3 years of steep and powerful sanctions, there is always a way around them. And so far, the sanctions have produced nothing but the exact opposite effects of what were intended. Putin is still in power, the war is going on, the Russian economy is actually growing, and according to the IMF, for 2 years in a row, it was the best performing economy in Europe. So yes, the BRICS are an outlet. But again, this is more than just a transactional phenomenon for the Russians, because the Russians are thinking globally and they're thinking long term, and they are treating the BRICS not just as a way to to outflank and outmaneuver the sanctions, they see in the BRICS a fundamentally new geo-economic global order, which is not going to disappear with the end of the war in Ukraine and perhaps the lifting of the sanctions. If all of them are lifted, which frankly I doubt, they are seeing this as a permanent structure that is going to be a historic turning point. We're all living through this. American policy seems to be helping them out greatly in this view, because if you simply compare what the U.S. camp looked like during the Cold War and what the U.S. camp looks like today, economically, the difference is really stark. If you compare North and South Korea to East and West Germany during the Cold War, it was clear back then that being in the U.S. camp meant prosperity and stability. These days, being in the U.S. camp means deindustrialization, as the Europeans are discovering. So this is a story we're going to be watching for many years to come, but it's interesting to see what will happen.
Gita, Wirjawan, under China's Belt and Road Initiative, the Jakarta-Bandung highway, high-speed railway rather, was built, and that's reduced travel time between the two cities considerably. Do you now see Indonesia looking to the new development bank for more finance for these kinds of infrastructure projects?
Oh, partly yes, but I think it's important to realize that, you know, Southeast Asia has been getting about $200 billion worth of FDI on a yearly basis. About 100 to 140 billion of those would go to Singapore. The rest, 25 to 31, would go to Indonesia. 10 to 20 would go to Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam each. So it depicts the idea that countries like Indonesia could, you know, do a bit better in terms of attracting FDI. And, you know, our president has indicated his desire to grow the economy at 8% per year. The baseline is really 5%. The additional 3% only means about $40 billion worth of additional FDI. So that's something that's doable. And that, I think, is something that's far more important for countries like Indonesia to work on, as opposed to, you know, relying upon multilateral institutions.
Okay, that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C.